The concept of a soul is one of those things you probably instinctively understand, but you might have trouble explaining to someone who'd never heard of it before. If that's the case, don't worry. You aren't the only one. We humans have been trying to figure out exactly what our souls are for literally thousands of years. During that time, countless ideas have been put forward by various religions and who's who of humanity's greatest thinkers. Whilst no single definition exists to this day, most people agree that the soul is a non-physical and possibly immortal part of us that essentially makes each of us who we are. Considering it's something we can't see or measure in any way, it's kind of interesting that almost every culture in history has believed in a human soul of some shape or form. For whatever reason, we seem to be predisposed to accept there's more to us than just meat and bones. Plenty of people have attempted to find out exactly that over the years. Science has an annoying habit of coming along and informing us humans that we aren't quite as special as we like to think we are. We used to believe the Earth was at the center of the universe, until some bloke called Aristarchus of Samos ruined everything by pointing out that the Earth actually seemed to be orbiting the sun. And Darwin rocked up more than 2,000 years later to bust the myth that we humans were somehow separate from the rest of the animal kingdom. It may well be that science slaying the soul is the next step on what has been a long and often uncomfortable journey for our species. But for many people, none of this matters in the slightest. Their belief in the existence of the soul is exactly that, a belief. It doesn't require evidence or proof, and therefore, science's opinion on the matter isn't really relevant.
The thinking goes, in the incredibly distant past, some bacteria started living within another larger bacterium. This relationship became symbiotic, where each organism benefited equally from the presence of the other.
To the mitochondrion as a whole, it looks almost like a separate cell in its own right. That's because at one point, it was. Plus, you don't just have a handful of mitochondria per cell, you have hundreds to thousands of them floating in your cells. And even that number depends on what type of tissue we're talking about. Like a skeletal muscle cell might be 3 to 8% mitochondria by volume, but a liver cell could be about 20%. Meanwhile, heart muscle cells are laughing at those numbers because they're about 35 to 40% mitochondria by volume. Now, all mitochondria do have some structural things in common. They each have two membranes, one outer layer, one inner layer, and some space in between them. That outer membrane works like a protective but permeable layer, letting different compounds in or out of the mitochondria. Meanwhile, the inner membrane is where some important biology happens to manufacture ATP. This is the molecule that fuels our major biological processes, so it's often called energy currency. Our DNA, which makes up our genes, is kept in our cell's nucleus, what I'll call nuclear DNA. Some of our nuclear DNA makes proteins for the mitochondria, then ships them out for it to use. But the mitochondria also has its own DNA, separate from the DNA in your cell's nucleus. Plus, it has the cellular machinery to make new mitochondrial proteins. This is the mitochondrial genome, or the entirety of its genetic information, and it's much smaller than the genome in the cell's nucleus. It's only a small circle with about 16,000 base pairs, while the nuclear genome has billions of base pairs. The information in our mitochondria's genes are similar to our maternal ancestors way, way back in the past. Sequencing that mitochondrial DNA and comparing genomes has allowed researchers to trace people back to a single female ancestor in Africa thousands of years ago and follow human migration. Now, why does mitochondrial DNA only come from your mother? The first is that egg cells hold way more mitochondrial DNA than sperm cells. It's around 200,000 molecules in an egg cell and like single digits in sperm cells. Egg cells outnumber sperm by a lot when it comes to mitochondrial DNA. Plus, sperm store most of their mitochondria in their metabolically active tails. Now, aside from helping your cells make energy and providing clues about our ancestry, the mitochondria is the powerhouse of the cell.
Now, don't get me wrong, prokaryotes are awesome. They're still the most numerous and diverse organisms on Earth, and they've managed to exploit just about every environment on the planet. But only eukaryotes have special organelles that provide them with energy, and these little engines have allowed us to grow bigger and more complex, forming the visible multicellular life that we know today. But maybe the most important story of all is fossilized within our own cells, and the cells of everyone you've ever met and every living thing you've ever seen.